Allah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, to our non-Muslim friends and guests, I want to extend a hearty peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mori Salakan. I'm very pleased to have with me as a special guest in this time when we are experiencing a double pandemic. In the United States, we are experiencing a COVID-19 pandemic, and also a pandemic rooted in social unrest around police violence, police abuse of power, especially in the African American community. We have a very brutal double status quo before us today, and the challenge lies in us being able to overcome a history of demonizing poor people and racializing poverty to reduce support for good policy. In the words of our dear brother Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, this is an opportunity for a reset. And that's what we're going to be talking about, inshallah ta'ala, today. My special guest is Imam Yusuf Rios. He's the resident scholar of the Islamic Learning Foundation. ILF is the Education and Tarbiya project of the Islamic Circle of North America. It seeks to provide a holistic approach to Islamic personality development through mentorship and didactics. Sheikh Yusuf was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to a devout Christian family. In his late teens, his goal was to become a Catholic monk. Later, he joined the Capuchin Franciscans Program at Borromeo Seminary in Wickliffe, Ohio, where he studied for 2.5 years in preparation to become a priest. During his studies at Borromeo Seminary, he studied Catholic and Western philosophy and theology. It is during this period in his life, in his 20s, that he discovered the path to Islam. He joined the Muslim community in Cleveland, Ohio, and began studying Islam more seriously for a number of years. His passion of learning Islam led him to join the student body at Islamic American University in Detroit, where he received his foundation in the Arabic and Islamic Sciences. He then traveled to Cairo, Egypt, where he continued his pursuit of Islamic knowledge for many years. Imam Yusuf has a bachelor's in Western philosophy and sociology from John Carroll University, and is working on a master's in Islamic Sciences at the Islamic University of Minnesota. He has served as an instructor with Islamic American University, Al-Huda University, Guidance College, and the Shaukani Institute. He is also a founding member of the Three Puerto Rican Imams project for relief and support of those who suffered after Hurricane Maria and, subhanAllah, the subsequent earthquake that took place in Puerto Rico as well. Without any further ado, I want to welcome our dear brother, Sheikh Yusuf Rios, to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mori Salakan. It is my deepest pleasure to have you with us, my brother. Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah. So let's begin, brother, with this interesting history you have, this personal history, your path to Islam. It's quite interesting. You were on a course to become a priest, and then there was this dramatic shift. Tell us a little bit more about that before we get into some of the other areas of substance in this conversation.
Wallahi, bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. You know, I grew up in North Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia, in brief, is a center which Puerto Ricans migrated to. You know, my grandparents, they migrated there. They were one of the first families. My family was one of the first families to go to Philadelphia. And so we had, as a family, a number of different experiences that were not necessarily those experiences of those who came after. So my family is the byproduct of having to leave Puerto Rico as an island because of the administrative policies that were there on the island, that and other, you know, world circumstances which created a bad economic situation. And Puerto Rico, you know, as is known as one of the oldest colonies. And so my experience, or it is the oldest colony in the world. You know, my experience as being a child that was born out of that decision of my grandparents to leave Puerto Rico to go into Philadelphia, and then grow up in an environment where the opportunities that people thought were there eventually were leaving. Because when I was growing up as a youth, by that time the factory systems were pretty much dismantled. Factories were outsourced. And in Philadelphia is a pretty racist place. It has changed on some levels, and on some levels it didn't. And so I grew up in a Puerto Rican community, and we grew up side by side with African Americans, and there was a lot of intermarrying, a lot of sharing, a lot of self-discovery. On the East Coast in general, that was the reality, that there was a lot of self-examination on these, you know, concepts that have been imposed upon people with regard to their identity. And so I struggled a lot being in that type of environment, you know, that was economically deprived. In my family, alhamdulillah, you know, my mother especially, she was always trying to stay ahead of the game. We were the children. I'm a child of those who got caught in the program of drugs being distributed in the inner cities of America to fund certain activities outside of the country. And I'm not going to go into much more detail other than to say that the conditions became very difficult. And so that caused me to really look at my condition and my community's condition and really try to struggle with the meaning of life. And that pushed me to become religious. And in that time period of self-searching and disorientation and so on and so forth, I have to admit that the African American community, specifically the Muslim African American community on the East Coast, were a force to be reckoned with regard to dawah. And so it was because of the impetus of those people doing dawah, the push on their part to re-examine who is Jesus. You know, that forced me to look at my own religious faith and to try to make sense of it. And I didn't want to just immediately abandon it, but I had posed a challenge to myself. I posed a challenge that I would study the faith of my fathers and try to really orient myself and do that work that was necessary, do a lot of that cultural study work, psychological work. And eventually that led me to go to study to be a priest. I wanted to be a monk, and that didn't manifest itself. But in the back of my mind was this idea of, is this the truth or is this not the truth? Because there were so many different elements of dawah at work, whether it was in popular culture or brothers actually doing dawah, especially on the East Coast, you know, that pushed me to be critical. And that's eventually what led me to go to be a priest, to study to be a priest, and then eventually it pushed me outside of Catholicism and into Islam.
Yeah, it's interesting, brother. And you know, it may come as a bit of a surprise, but your brother Salah Khan, my early formative years from about age 3 or 4 up until I was 16 years of age, I grew up right across the bridge from you. In fact, early on, my family lived for a short while in Philadelphia. Then we moved across the bridge to Camden, New Jersey, where I spent most of my early formative years before moving on to Connecticut when I was at the age of 16, and spending a number of years there before moving to the Washington area. So I am very familiar with the area, with that whole, you know, that whole section of the Northeast corner. And you're right. I mean, in Camden too, there was this close living and associating, relationship that the African American and Puerto Rican communities had. Quite interesting. Aki, you are part of a project, the Three Puerto Rican Imams, who responded to the humanitarian crisis that arose in Puerto Rico in the wake of, back-to-back crises. What's the situation there now in Puerto Rico? What is the condition of that territory, that U.S. territory?
The situation in Puerto Rico it has deteriorated. One of the reasons why it has deteriorated is it goes back to a point that I was similarly mentioned earlier, was that, just like in U.S. cities, there was an investment in those cities. The industrial infrastructure is what kept people working. So Puerto Rico had gone through a phase where there was industry, there was businesses, and eventually a lot of that was dismantled. And so it created an economic situation in Puerto Rico that became compounded. Not only the political situation of being a colony impacts it because of the Jones Act in specific and other issues, but the Jones Act, what it does is it doesn't allow Puerto Rico to make economic decisions in its own interest. And so although the U.S. invests some money, what the U.S. takes out of it is much more than what the U.S. puts in. And by the way, the Puerto Rican people, they pay taxes. And so they're the ones that are really, investing in the system and not really getting much out of it. And so that compound situation of the political status and the economic status has caused the situation in Puerto Rico to deteriorate more, because whatever jobs were there that were pushing people out of poverty, that it left, and then you don't have sovereignty to be able to make economic decisions. And there's other things that have taken place with corruption and so on and so forth. And so Puerto Rico is going through a very difficult time. It has one of the highest crime rates within the U.S. boundaries, so to speak, political boundaries. It has an extremely high murder rate by guns, and it has a horrible problem with domestic violence towards women, and even the killing of women. And so this situation is really one in which the psychology of the people is not being examined. It's easy to say there's criminality and so on and so forth, but the psychology of the people is such that political status and that economic situation has made life deteriorate. That doesn't mean that there's no positives on the island and there's no good things going on. There's tons of good things going on. There's tons of efforts. But what has happened in Puerto Rico now is that there is, after Maria, or the Hurricane Maria, the federal funds that were supposed to go, these federal funds were collected by taxpayer money that were supposed to go to rebuild the island, never got there during this administration's time. And so it has compounded the problem of Puerto Rico, that you had all of this baggage already of the situation deteriorating, and then you have these hurricanes, because there were two. There was Irma and Maria. Maria was the one that hit the hardest, and then you have the earthquakes. And so in the middle of that, you have political corruption. You have a number of different issues. So the situation in Puerto Rico is not looking too good in terms of the status of the people. The medical infrastructure has been collapsed in many places. It was already going that way with privatization, but it has collapsed even further because of the hurricane. And again, the funds that were promised never got there, and then there's political corruption, so monies were stolen. So Puerto Rico is really on a gridlock, and the future of Puerto Rico is hanging, on the thread. There's gentrification that's there, so we see similar effects to Hawaii, and there's the issue of inflation. There's the issue of inflation, and up to now, there's no stimulus package aid. And now they're kind of begin to see some of the COVID cases go up. And so it's really a situation in which is problematic. The mental health condition of the people has deteriorated because you have people that, they were suffering from PTSD from going through a hurricane, and they lost everything, and they began to rebuild, and they were kind of seeing the light, and then they got hit with the earthquakes on one part of the island, and then just now the economic decisions that were taken by the local government, and the fact that the federal government really never sent the monies there to see them distributed properly. there's a relationship between the federal government, the local government, which has strangled the people. It has caused a mental health crisis, and that's kind of where things are at, and the people overall in Puerto Rico are really looking for Congress to be part of that solution. Before, people were going to the UN and making the case about Puerto Rico's status, but really the fate and the status of Puerto Rico is decided in Congress itself. And it seems to be an issue that is always marginalized or put to the side or neglected. And that's overall, what's going on in Puerto Rico.
That picture of Puerto Rico today and in the near term, it looks so bleak. And then on top of that, we have this COVID-19 pandemic. How has that been impacting the island? Is it as bad as it is in parts of the mainland?
The reality of the situation with COVID is really not properly understood. I was in Puerto Rico in March, and so the psychology was much different than what I was getting here, because I was there in March, and then I came here, and then we went on lockdown, and so I saw the psychological difference. It even personally impacted me to be in those two worlds, because it was just a shock coming back, and then it began to take hold there. The problem is that in Puerto Rico, the testing was never done, right? And there's reasons people have speculated as why it was not done. And there was a corruption scandal that surrounded around the tests, the COVID-19 tests. There was some scandal with money and who got contracts and so on and so forth. But also, the testing that was done was not considered to be approved by the FDA in many cases. And then, again, the hospital system wasn't really prepared. So we really don't know what the actual numbers are, and there's a lot of speculation, but at face value, it hasn't impacted Puerto Rico like it has impacted other countries in Latin America, or like in the Dominican Republic, or in some of the other countries, like in Colombia or other places like that. There's been places in Latin America where COVID really has created a serious problem. So that's one issue. But what has created a problem with the COVID is that although there's some praiseworthy aspects to what had happened, the local government, they took the strictest measures within U.S. boundaries to engage in a lockdown. And so that lockdown has collapsed sectors of the economy, and so now that's what the reality of where COVID is at is similar to what people are arguing and debating about in the mainland. And that's the issue of the economics of this all. How to create an economy that was already suffering, that's already burdened by debt and so on and so forth. And because Puerto Rico has a massive debt that was accumulated by venture capitalists and colonial government, and they have blamed the people for that. So that's the reality at the end of the day, that the COVID-19, the medical side of it, there's cases which seem to be rising, but we don't really know the extent because the testing hasn't been firm enough for us to make real informed conclusions. And then the economic side has compounded all those problems because of the decisions of how the COVID lockdown took place.
Okay, my brother, moving right along, you have been pretty active in the social media sphere, especially on Facebook, with your periodic presentations, bringing attention and perspective to the challenges that we as a nation are facing right now in the wake of this socio-political pandemic called policing in America, and the reaction to what happened to a black man, one of many, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was a trigger that unleashed something that was long in the making. And you are on the same page as I in seeing this moment as a a very unique moment in American history. Share with the viewing audience your perspective on what has been going on from coast to coast here in this country and abroad as a result of the police homicide, the unjust and very brutal police homicide of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Your perspective.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. There's so much to be said here that is almost, it's challenging to know where to begin. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that there's actually been 4 police killings including George Floyd, within this time period of a couple weeks or 3 weeks about. 3 have been African American and 1 was a Latino who was shot 22 times. And recently, last night in Atlanta, there was another killing, and the guy was shot in the back, and the details are still being worked out as to why that took place. But the local authorities have been, because there's a Wendy's that the person was shot at that has been burnt down, and that took place last night. So the killings continue. I think that we're at a critical moment. This can be looked at from a number of different angles. This is the U.S. dealing with its own apartheid, for the South African community. This is something that, this is something very similar to the challenges that were being faced and still being dealt with, when it comes to the issue of apartheid. I think for the Muslim community, just as in the time of the apartheid, the Muslim community, there were those who took certain stances which put them on the right side of history, and those who took other stances that put them on the wrong side of history, and by the way, put them on the wrong side as far as an Islamic position. And so we right now, as a Muslim community, that's what we're facing. Like I said, there's a number of different ways that we can talk about what's going on, but because this is a Muslim audience, I wanted to address that issue, that we are at a critical moment where the viability of the Islamic discourse and practice is being challenged. And many Muslims are looking at this as just an event of history that's passing, and they're not seeing how it is that the positions that are being taken in the discourses and the postures of the Muslim community is really going to shape the next 25 years, in my opinion, to maybe 50 years, about 2 generations, so on and so forth, of relationships that Muslims have to each other and that Muslims have to the society. This is, a reality in which it should have been addressed a long time ago, but there's been so much neglect, in this regard, in terms of racial justice, that it is created a situation which has deteriorated to this extent. One of the things that I think for the Muslim community is important to understand is that when the Muslims decided to take on the Islamophobia platform as a way to address injustice, there were discussions that were taken in Muslim circles to leave out addressing the issue of racism and to just deal with the issue of discrimination against Muslims from a religious perspective. And that is because there was a divide already in the Muslim community between certain ethnic groups and, let's say, the indigenous Muslims. And so the discourse of basically this social justice discourse of Islam became slanted, and it became very class-based, and it became directed towards alleviating the conditions of discrimination that only one group was facing. And so the Muslim community has contributed to this problem. There's another issue, and this is very controversial. George Floyd, the police were called on George Floyd, and that store was owned by a Muslim. And there was another store that was recent, that was close in proximity, that was shut down. Their lease was revoked because of comments that were made. The Holy Land store, and this is all public in the public. There were racist comments that were made. There's no way to kind of like give husn al-dhan or a good opinion of it, or there's no way to bring another interpretation or an excuse or whatever. And so what has happened similar to the South Africa system of stratifying the society, the Muslims have fallen into a middle ground between, in specific, the African American community and the Latinos and the rest of the society, or European American society. And I don't put it up here to say that whites are superior to anyone, but it's just that to try to say that there's a middle position here. And so the middle position that the Muslim, not all of the Muslim community, but a large segment of the Muslim community has taken, is to be part of the process of exploitation. This is something that's extremely controversial, but we have to analyze where we're at in the world, because we are demanding justice in the world. And we're asking for justice for Muslims, but we're forgetting about justice for humanity. And so the Muslims have operated in this form of extracting wealth out of these communities that have been systematically impoverished. And Black doesn't equal impoverishment in America. You know, it impacts poverty impacts a significant amount of the community, but not all Blacks are impoverished. So we shouldn't automatically associate impoverishment and failure with Blackness. But the Muslim community has undermined the message of dawah that I was talking about, that I had experienced when I came into Islam. Because in a lot of the urban centers, Islam meant transformation and change and empowerment and justice and dignity and building and community. It meant light. It meant goodness. It meant another change that was in the interest of human dignity and development. And with this middle position, middleman minority position that many Muslims have taken, and having their businesses in these cities, they've taken a position of exploitation and forgot about the role of Islam in these communities. And so it's unfortunate, but you know, this is at the heart of the problem. You know, the role of the Muslim community in this regard. We can't not avoid having this discussion. This is a discussion which many refuse to have because it brings bad attention to the Muslim community. But the fact that George Floyd was called to a Muslim establishment and it led to that shows that the role of the Muslims in these communities is not productive by any means. And I'm not the only one that has taken that position. Many have taken that position. Some haven't vocalized it. But the institution Iman, Rami, who is a Palestinian activist, he did an interview with National Public Radio, NPR. And this issue came up, and is a tragedy. It's a tragedy that National Public Radio did an interview with a Muslim leader, and this topic came out and it went on the national scene as being part of the national discussion about the role of Muslim stores being exploitative in these environments. And it stayed within that realm, you know, basically within the NPR circle, but Muslims are scared to have this discussion. So my view on this is that this is an opportunity to reframe our discourse, to look at ourselves and what is the role that we're playing in the world, what is our role in this society. And there's a number of different ideas that have to be challenged. We have to challenge this idea when we're living in these Muslim majority, non-Muslim majority lands, that we just have this this divided role, or this bifurcated vision where we're looking at them and us. We have to look at ourselves as part of this society. No, we're not going to get lost like the Muslims were lost in Bosnia, but we have to look at the humanity of others and what Islamic teaching says about our neighbor without political correctness, and what it is that we contribute back to the society. That's the first thing. So we have to look at what it is that Islamic tradition says about living in these lands, outside of just saying that this is a place of kufr. That's not going to work. We have other teachings which give us responsibility, that this is, for instance, we deal with people according to their orientation. So we're the people that have accepted the da'wah, but others are the recipients of da'wah, and they have rights over us, and we should look at that. The other issue is that the role of the indigenous Muslims, the U.S. is unique in that the U.S. has a large indigenous community of Muslims. It's not like other places where Islam has gone into. And so what is the role of the Muslim community in making sure that the indigenous community develops itself? And so we have to look at the way zakat is being distributed, and the way that sadaqah is being dealt with, and the way that we look at community work. And so for a long time, we made excuses as to why we can't follow the default position on zakat, especially zakatul fitr, that the zakat stays in the locality of which is collected in. and we look to scholarship to say that we can transfer zakat to other places in the world. That was a decision that was made by a segment of the Muslim community, which felt as though everyone in America or the US is okay. We don't, they took that decision for the community. And so these are the types of decisions in fiqh and in thinking that have undermined the growth of the indigenous community. There's some internal issues as well, but this is a time period to like re-examine internal issues to the indigenous community. But this is the time period to examine the relationship that different Muslim groups have to each other, and to see how it is that our thinking Islamically can change and our practice can change to be empowering, because we're part of the problem. And the Muslim community is part of this problem. There's another issue is that I personally believe is detrimental to our growth and our development. And that is not understanding the life of El-Hajj, Malik, El-Shabazz, or Malcolm X, rahmatullahi alayhi, properly. I personally hold that Malcolm X has qualities of revival. He's one that has attuned us to the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to what it means, what Islam means to human beings. And some people may say, oh, well, brother, we understand that, and they take lightly of that. But no, that is something which is not being practiced or really put at the forefront in Islamic thinking. If we look at the Bangladeshi that's working in Saudi Arabia, is it that Bangladeshi worker in Saudi Arabia being treated like a brother in Islam with rights of citizenship and this and that? No, so we're not talking about equality. If we look at, in terms of the real way that Muslims are practicing, if we look at, for instance, the fact that, when we look at what happened in Yemen with Saudi Arabia, and these are very controversial topics, we see that, for instance, the Yemeni life, it was put under the banner of, well, you're from this group or that group. So then what happens to the brotherhood of Islam? And when we look at the role of the African, you know what I'm saying? What is the role? We look at the role of the Pakistani worker in the Gulf state. So we can go on and on. We look at the tragedy of the Muslims in India right now, or the Rohingya, and we're asking for the human dignity of that group to be preserved. But we ourselves, in our practice, we have not upheld those teachings to such an extent that we can hold each other accountable. And so I believe that Malcolm X preceded us in a lot of this thinking as being a problem. And see, with globalization, some of this stuff has been exported, but this is not totally, we can't just blame the Europeans and white supremacy for this 100%, because we have the guidance of Islam. But we are in a time period where we also have to challenge white supremacy. If we want to reconstruct the world, and that does not mean being against Europeans. It does not mean being against Europeans. What it means is, addressing a system which is really not a system which is just, and is not a system which allows us to flourish as human beings. When you have Muslim countries that are investing in skin bleacher, that skin bleaching, what's invested in it is enough to prop up multiple nations. That's how much money, if we were to put all of the Muslim world together, and we were to see what portion of their gross domestic product is being, what portion of the economy is being invested in skin bleaching, then it'll be something which is eye-opening, and it shows the psychology that we have. It's not the psychology of a healthy Muslim, because we're hating the bodies that Allah created us with, and how we deal with each other. And we shouldn't reproduce systems like the apartheid or the caste system of India, or any system, or the systems that we're seeing here, if we really want to talk about Islamic values and contributing back to the world. So I believe we need to examine the legacy of Al-Hajj Malik Al-Shabazz in that regard, and regard him as being one who can be considered a reviver of certain aspects of the deen, even having the boldness to talk about the political problems in your society as a Muslim and stand up for issues of justice. We don't necessarily have to take on every orientation that he put forward, but there's just certain things that the Muslims are neglecting, which have got us to this situation that we're in now, whether it's in the US or in the Muslim world. And that's the stagnation and the isolation approach, and the accepting of injustices which come back to haunt us. If you look at the state of India, if you look at the state of South Africa, if you look at the conditions in the US, the question is not to blame these societies 100%. But the question is, where do we stand as Muslims, right? And I think that we have enough tools to be able to deal with these affairs, and we have to start to deal with them, or else we will continue with the crisis or the crises that are hating human beings. And we're about to go into a global economic crisis. And so as the economies of the world shrink, ethnic strife will come about more and more. That's a fact. We'll be fighting not only over ethnicity, but we'll be fighting over resources. And we as Muslims have to be the middle nation and stand in with some solutions to these issues, or else we're going to see more and more tragedy. And that's what we're seeing as history unfolds. We're seeing populations just turn in on themselves. And that's something that we can't afford to say that we're not going to be involved in, because that's not a Muslim problem. You know, but it is definitely affecting the Muslims, and we're starting to see now that the Muslims are engaging in these issues.
Absolutely agree with the perspective that you just shared. On that note of this spectacular and long overdue awakening taking place in certain corners of the Muslim world, both domestically and internationally. In fact, on the international front, I have been pleasantly amazed at at the degree to which I have heard the voices of Muslims abroad, prominent Muslims abroad, weighing in on this situation in America that has the attention of the entire world. You know, not every perspective coming from abroad is one that I agree with, but the mere fact that it has forced, it has compelled Muslims who in the past have been silent on these kinds of issues to suddenly have an opinion that they want to thrust into the international public square for consideration. You know, I don't know about you, but my position has been that there is no matter how learned and respected the scholar is abroad, there is no scholar abroad, born and raised and living abroad, that can impose a solution to what is happening here in America on us. You know, it's just not feasible. But alhamdulillah, there is this discussion taking place. There is this debate taking place, and much of it has been positive. I only wonder, you know, how long, you know, this discussion and debate is going to be sustained. I mean, because we know that these types of occurrences, they have a beginning and an end. The kind of attention right now that's on America and on this system and on demands for serious change, you know, this intensity is going to wane over the course of time. You know, what's going to happen tomorrow? I'm somewhat encouraged by a lot of the discussions and some of the debates that are taking place within the Muslim community here in the United States, because I have, in my work as a human rights advocate, brother, I have seen some of the best coming from us, and I have seen some of the worst of the worst. I mean, your brother Saleh Khan has been in situations where I have been at national conventions and conferences. I'm talking about national Muslim conventions and conferences, advocating in a peaceful way, in a brotherly way, and what I thought in every case was a very tactful way for our political prisoners like Dr. Afia Siddiqui or Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin and the countless others who have been taken from their families in very brutal fashion and transferred into federal prisons all throughout this disturbed land, advocating for them, advocating for our brothers and sisters, our leaders and our policymakers within our community, not to forget them. And I've had the police called on me by my brothers in some of these situations. So, I mean, I've seen a lot in my roughly 30 years of doing this work. And I'm hoping that this is the opportunity. Well, it is an opportunity. I hope that it is an opportunity that we will seize for a very serious reset, you know, in how we view ourselves, how we view each other, how we view our responsibility as Muslims, especially in a land like the United States of America that, you know, despite its shortcomings, and the shortcomings are very significant, still has enormous influence on the international bloc. I mean, I just hope and pray that we will seize this moment and not just in the moment, but really do something that is going to have a dramatic positive effect on us going forward and on the land that we call home going forward. So, you know, I want to take this moment to applaud the efforts that you have been making. I know it has not been easy. I know that some of the positions that you have taken have not been warmly embraced. I'm sure you've got your moments of pushback, but you know, alhamdulillah, often I hear you, brother, I say, well, that is certainly my brother from another mother, you know, alhamdulillah, and we think a lot alike, and I really appreciate what you have been bringing to the table, and I pray to Allah Ta'ala that those that you have influence over, that you have influence with, and especially the young Muslims that are in your charge, that you have influence on, you know, will greatly benefit from, you know, the knowledge that you're bringing to the table, the insights that you're bringing to the table, from the very unique position that you're coming from, and they will understand that we all have, and especially the young, we have an opportunity to seize this moment and to make as much good of it as we possibly can. And on the issue of the young, one of the things that I've noticed in the vast majority of these demonstrations, in fact, all of these demonstrations, and all of the demonstrations that I've seen video of, I've seen photographs from, I've participated in a couple of demonstrations here in the Washington, D.C. area. The Muslims that you see out there are overwhelmingly young. There's this new generation that instinctively understand that they have a responsibility. Many of them, you know, they have different levels of understanding of their deen, you know, but they understand that that there is a requirement for them to be out there and for them to add their voice to the voices that are calling for change, and that has for me been very, very encouraging. I'm reminded of that that observation that was made by Frantz Fanon in his celebrated work Wretched of the Earth. He said each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And this is something that our young Muslims of all different tribes instinctually understand, and the other young people. I mean, the vast majority of these folk who are attending these massive demonstrations are young people. Most of them, the vast majority, are young. And the other thing that gives me reason for optimism is how diverse these mobilizations are, how very diverse they are, how huge they are in number, and how diverse they are, and how they have been sustained. You know, every day there have been demonstrations in some part of the United States, and then there are the demonstrations abroad. This is a very unique moment that we're in. And with that being said, what is your view? I mean, there's been from certain quarters some pushback on Black Lives Matter as an organization. Now, I have my view, and I've expressed my view on some of the criticism that has been aimed at this organization. And some of the criticism that has been directed from certain quarters, from certain Muslim quarters, and some of these Muslim quarters are brothers who are supposed to be, and some sisters who are, well informed Islamically. They're knowledgeable folk. There's nevertheless this criticism that, in my humble opinion, can be distracting, unnecessarily distracting when it comes to Black Lives Matter as an organization. Now, I've made it very clear in my perspective that Black Lives Matter as a principle is nothing new. This is something that has been with us, Aki, for decades upon decades upon decades of struggle. It is nothing new. In fact, even the terminology, I've heard the terminology in years past. But the organization that has taken this on as its name, and it has this very large and pronounced position, this face in the public square, and no doubt it has been receiving money from a large amount of money from different entities, some of them entities that don't mean the better of the two Americas well. But all that being said, in my humble opinion, well, I'm not going to give my opinion in this moment. I'm going to ask you for yours. What is your thought on Black Lives Matter as an organization? I know what your thought is on Black Lives Matter as a principle. You're right in lockstep with your brother Salah Khan. But the Black Lives Matter organization, what is your perspective on this organization? And should Muslims, young Muslims who have an affinity toward that organization, should they be dissuaded from being a part of that organization and its work? What's your opinion?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. The issue that we confront is really one which has a lot to do with how we deal with ideas and values, and two, how we deal with pluralistic societies that are secular, right? And then there's the issue of cooperating with the non-Muslims. That's the third point. There's a lot of issues that we can get into in this. And then there's the issue of supporting something which may support values which we don't agree with. And so it becomes a complicated issue. Black Lives Matters as a movement, as an organization, there are things in their program that are Islamic and things that are un-Islamic. And there's things that are neutral, that it takes what they do and what they believe is just like anything else in how we deal with it Islamically. Like there's things that are neutral, there's things that are clearly prohibited, and there's things that are, halal, so to speak, or things that are even obligatory to deal with. So we're talking about a non-Muslim group in a secular society. And so there is no group in this republic democracy that, there's no group that you can completely support or completely deny in a lot of ways, except some of the groups that are at the extreme level of what they believe is, as far as the destruction of others. And so the reality of Black Lives Matters is that we can't judge that group the way that we're going to judge an Islamic group, and so we have to look at them for who they are. We have to look at certain things that, they have promoted and certain orientations that they have. And anything that they have that supports human dignity, there's no issue with that. Maybe some people have the issue with Black Lives Matters because some people are like, well, they're supported by George Soros or they're a leftist liberal group. But we live in that type of society. So everybody's not going to have values that we agree with 100%, or everybody's not going to be someone that we have to be against, or everyone is not going to be our friend. You know, we differ with each other as Muslims. I hate to kind of dance around, but that's the reality. If Black Lives Matters as an organization is effective in promoting certain values of Islam, you know, that are there that we're not promoting, then, you know, and we're sitting here just critiquing Black lives as an organization, in some senses is problematic, because it shows that we're in a moral dilemma. And I actually just did a live about this, that people that are claiming focus on yourself and your own spiritual development, or they're conservative on the conservative side, they're in a moral dilemma, because you have an organization that's moving for social justice. It has a Black face to it, and it is taking stances, and they happen to support homosexuality and transsexuality and so on and so forth. And they're taking a justice platform in an area in which the Muslims are not even in that area. There's no platform that the Muslims have with these issues. So it actually creates a dilemma for us, which we have to go back and self-examine ourselves, versus looking at this organization and seeing where we stand 100%. There's been English-speaking leadership that has come out of Saudi Arabia talking about all lives matter, you know, that, you know, and Black Lives Matter is an agenda. There's been out of the UK this type of mindset and so on and so forth. Where were people at when the Muslims were being destroyed? They didn't stand by us, and they didn't, you know, they never mentioned anything like Amnesty International, or, you know, they never mentioned the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, you know, and how they, you know, have stood up for the Muslims and their legal rights, their international rights. You know, they never mention other groups. So we can't judge them. We have to realize that the homosexual community, and this is very controversial, we have to realize that the LGBT community, properly said, is struggling as a social justice organization. And sure, they have their own orientation and values that they're pushing, but they're struggling as a social justice organization right now and initiating tons of change. So my thing on the Black Lives Matters is that, you know, we have to analyze what is it that they're calling for as far as individual points of their agenda. With the things that we disagree with is already clear. And then, so the issue becomes more of like dialoguing on whether this is good for society or not. And where we disagree with them, and we're clear. We say we disagree with this point. That brings us into the issue or the challenge. Can Muslims work in a pluralistic society with people that they disagree with? And this was a challenge of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring brought up this challenge between the Islamists and the secularists and how they can cooperate with each other. If you have a group of people that you may not agree with them in their personal lives, or you may not agree with certain aspects of their belief system and their value system, but they're calling you to good and to align with them on bringing about a more just society on certain levels. The question becomes is, do you reject that, or do you accept it, or what do you do? It's a challenge. There's no easy solution to that. Because if a change is being made, which is going to bring about more Islamic teaching in the society than was there, are we saying that we can't participate in that, or we can't align ourselves with them on this particular point because they're gay or they're LGBT or whatever? That becomes a challenge. That's a major challenge which we, you know, faced as Muslims before, because, you know, we're talking about the issue of people promote shirk. And there was alignments that were made between the Muslims and people of shirk, whether it was the people of the book or not, to bring about a more just society. The Medinan Pact was an agreement that was made between people of kufr.
That's
they
right.
believed openly in shirk.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and actually some people in the Black Lives Matters movement, they're religious. And it doesn't mean that I'm giving a blanket card to say we should support 100%. What I'm saying is we've never been in this dilemma. We don't have these types of discussions. I personally, as an individual, can only say that it's something that has to be brought to the table in an actual, real conversation, not a conversation of just Xing them out, but a conversation of where do we stand on these types of issues? Because we live in a pluralistic society. This is not going to go away. is going to continue to be the case. What happens if there's a gay president, like there's a gay mayor in Chicago? So we don't cooperate with the mayor's office because the gay person is the leader? You know, that is a question that I'm raising. You know, so these things, I think that the Muslims are being challenged on radically on what is our stance on justice. Technically speaking, is a sin, if you want to look at it from a theological perspective. So are we saying that we can't align ourselves with sinners to do good just because the person is a sinner? And then how do we know the person is sinning? Because the issue of homosexuality or the LGBT thing, where we have the problem that is that the person has the orientation, we have a problem with the act. So we're not in their bedrooms with them. And I'm saying stuff that is very controversial for Muslims to really deal with. We're not in their bedrooms with them. So what they do in their bedroom is not my concern. Even if we were in an Islamic country, state, what is in private is in private. Our debate is what is going on in the public sphere, in the public sphere. So if in the public sphere they're calling for justice, I personally, whether people like it or not, I personally will align with them in the call for justice. That's the bottom line.
Alhamdulillah. Well said, my brother. Well said. And I appreciate that response, and I concur. We are now at the time for this conversation to come to an end. Before we do, I want to again thank you. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join me for this conversation. I thank you, brother, for the perspective that you bring to this table during this time of challenge for us all. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to bless you with good health of both mind and body and spirit, to enable you to continue doing the important work that you're doing out of Chi-Town, mashallah. I want to say to the technicians of Salah Media that I want to conclude this program with a brief statement, a brief 5-minute statement concerning something that is one of the burning issues during this time of challenge here in the United States. The whole issue of police and policing and defunding and the width and breadth of the crisis that actually exists. There's been a lot of debate around how pervasive police misconduct, police brutality is. And I want to share something. Just take a few short minutes at the end of this program to share something with our viewers as a whetting of the appetite for something that I'm going to present later in one of my Facebook Live presentations beginning this evening. Inshallah ta'ala, this evening I'm going to do a Facebook Live presentation in part 1 of this series, and just continue to do one each evening until we exhaust this very special study that USA Today engaged in. It's a very, very provocative study, and I'm sure that this will be one that you will be very interested in reading yourself, Sheikh Yusuf, and making it a part of your discussions going forward around this issue of policing in America. But with that said, my brother, again, I want to thank you. May Allah ta'ala bless you. May Allah bless your family. May Allah bless the work that you're doing in your community. And I consider the Islamic Circle of North America that they have a real jewel in having a brother like you within their fold, leading the area of study and development, Islamic development of our young that you're engaged in. May Allah ta'ala bless you going forward. Assalamu alaikum, my brother. Now I'm going to go to this statement I want to share. This USA Today is engaged in a study. In fact, it began in 2019. It began last year. It led a national effort to publish disciplinary records for police officers. This is very important, brothers and sisters. So this is very, very important. So please take what you're about to hear to heart. And inshallah ta'ala, if you're able to join us for the presentations that will begin 7:30 this evening, Eastern Standard Time. That's Washington, D.C., New York City time. And then they're going to continue each day until I get through the published part of this study that USA Today has engaged in. Again, in 2019, USA Today led a national effort to publish disciplinary records for police officers. George Floyd's death has renewed calls for transparency. Also, it has ignited calls for police departments to be defunded, which is, for understandable reasons, a very controversial and hotly debated matter right now. At least 85,000 law enforcement officers, 85,000 law enforcement officers across the USA have been investigated or disciplined for misconduct over the past decade. Officers have beaten members of the public, planted evidence, and used their badges to harass women. They have lied, stolen, dealt drugs, driven drunk, and abused their spouses. Despite their roles as public servants, the men and women who swear an oath to keep communities safe can generally avoid public scrutiny for their misdeeds. The records of their misconduct are filed away, rarely seen by anyone outside their departments. Police unions and their political allies have worked to put special protections in place, ensuring some records are shielded from public view or even destroyed. Reporters from USA Today, its affiliated newsrooms across the country, and the nonprofit Invisible Institute in Chicago spent more than a year creating the biggest collection of police misconduct records. Obtained from thousands of state agencies, prosecutors, police departments, and sheriffs, the records detail at least 200,000 incidents of alleged misconduct. Much of it previously unreported. The records obtained include more than 110,000 internal affairs investigations by hundreds of individual departments and more than 30,000 officers who were decertified by 44 state oversight agencies. Now, brothers and sisters, I'm going to stop here and just invite you to join your brother Salah Khan this evening when I go through the first part of this series that we're going to be doing each day, beginning at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time this evening. It's a thought-provoking study, and it's one that I don't care what side of the political fence you're on. I don't care how you feel, what your perspective is on law enforcement as a general rule. I don't care how you feel about the upheavals that we have seen in America and abroad as a result of what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is something that if you are concerned, truly concerned about the health and welfare of this country called America, this is something that you don't want to just ignore. This is some serious stuff. So inshallah ta'ala, I'll be back with you this evening. Those of you who can join me on Facebook at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time for the first in this series. And inshallah ta'ala, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that with all of all of the conscious effort that has been going into the call for police reform, that this country that likes to view itself and project itself internationally around the world as the land of liberty and justice for all, will certainly take heed before it's too late. Again, I want to extend a very, very special, warm, brotherly thanks to my brother Sheikh Yusuf Rios. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to have him with us again in the near future, inshallah ta'ala. But we want to thank him. May Allah ta'ala bless him and his work. May Allah ta'ala bless the community that he serves. And may Allah ta'ala bless us all, those of us who are striving, irrespective of what creed we belong to or creed we don't belong to. And Allah ta'ala blesses those of us who are truly, truly in our heart of hearts. We want the best for ourselves. We want the best for our families. We want the best for our communities. We want the best for our nation. We want the best for our world. May Allah ta'ala bless those of us who truly feel this way with the wherewithal to maintain the struggle, no matter how dark things may appear to be. We remind ourselves of that verse in the Quran that reads in Arabic, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati, wa tawassaw bil haqq, wa tawassaw bis sabr. The English translation, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. By the token of time through the ages, surely mankind is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. May Allah Ta'ala bless you. May Allah Ta'ala bless Salam Media, and may Allah Ta'ala bless those of us who are on the path of Islam to die not except in Islam. Ameen. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.